deep in the Cascade Range of southwestern Washington state, where fog clings to ancient trees like something alive. The Gifford-Pinchot National Forest sprawls across 1.3 million acres of wilderness that has never been fully tamed. This is a place where experienced hunters still go missing, where search and rescue teams find tracks they cannot explain, where even the rangers, when pressed after hours, will admit there are valleys they prefer not to patrol alone. The forest takes its name from America's first chief of the Forest Service, but long before any federal designation, the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest knew these mountains as something else entirely: sacred ground, forbidden ground. The Cowlitz, Yakima, and Klickitat tribes spoke of the Siatik, tall beings covered in reddish-brown hair that walked upright through the deepest woods. Not spirits exactly, but not animals either. Guardians of places humans were not meant to go. The elders warned their young, take only what you need from the forest, show respect, and never venture into certain valleys when the mist comes down. Those who ignored these warnings sometimes returned with stories of being watched by something massive, moving parallel to their path through the trees. Others did not return at all. When European loggers arrived in the 1890s, they brought chainsaws and disbelief, but the forest had a way of teaching humility. The trees here are ancient giants, Douglas firs and western red cedars, reaching over 200 feet tall. Their trunks so massive that 3 men linking hands cannot encircle them. Beneath this canopy exists a permanent twilight world where moss grows thick as carpet and sword ferns tower over a grown man's head. Sound behaves strangely here. Voices carry when they shouldn't, or get swallowed completely by the density of growth. The terrain is brutally unforgiving. Volcanic ridges drop into narrow canyons where cold streams rush over black basalt. Elevation changes are severe and sudden. Winter snowpack can reach 20 feet in the high country, sealing off entire drainages for months. Even today, with modern trail systems and GPS technology, there are sections of the Gifford-Pinchot where cell service doesn't exist, and a wrong turn can leave you disoriented in a maze of identical-looking ravines. By the 1920s, logging camps dotted the forest, temporary towns of rough men doing dangerous work in near-total isolation. They worked by kerosene lamp in the permanent shadow of the canopy, felling trees with handsaws and axes. Men died regularly from falling timber and equipment failures. But they also brought back other stories. Enormous footprints, 18 inches long with 5 distinct toes, found in muddy clearings far from any camp. Rhythmic wood-knocking echoing across valleys at night, deliberate and patterned, coming from ridges where no crews were working, supplies vanishing from locked sheds with no sign of forced entry, just those massive tracks in the mud outside. The most famous incident occurred in 1924 at Ape Canyon, a remote gorge on the flank of Mount St. Helens. A group of miners reported being attacked over several nights by large creatures that threw rocks at their cabin with alarming accuracy. These were not scared city folk, but experienced outdoorsmen. Yet they abandoned a gold claim rather than spend another night in that canyon. Their story made newspapers across the state. Skeptics called it a hoax or misidentified bears. The men never changed their account. During World War II, military personnel training in the region filed similar reports with the Forest Service. The archived documents, now publicly available, describe the same elements appearing again and again. Massive bipedal tracks, vocalizations unlike any known animal, glimpses of large figures moving through dense forest with impossible speed and silence. After the war, as mechanized logging replaced hand crews, the old camps were simply abandoned. Their ruins still stand throughout the forest, collapsing bunkhouses and equipment sheds, slowly being consumed by ferns and moss. these sites have developed an unsettling reputation. Wildlife avoids them. Rangers report a persistent sense of being observed. Trail cameras malfunction with unusual frequency, capturing frames of complete darkness when something large should have triggered them, or showing massive heat signatures at the frame's edge that vanish in the next photo taken seconds later. Then came May 18th, 1980. Mount St. Helens erupted with a force that flattened 230 square miles of forest. The lateral blast killed everything in its path. 57 people died. Some never recovered. The mountain lost over 1,000 feet of elevation in minutes. In the decades since, the blast zone has regenerated, but it remains otherworldly. Thousands of bleached dead trees still stand like silver bones across the slopes. New growth has emerged, but the forest here is different. Thinner, more exposed. Compasses behave erratically in certain areas. Electronic devices drain their batteries at inexplicable rates. There are places where sound seems to warp, voices carrying for miles, or being dampened as if absorbed by something invisible. The modern Gifford Pinchot is managed by the U.S. Forest Service, with ranger stations maintaining permits and trail systems. But the infrastructure is misleading. Step off the maintained paths and you enter genuine wilderness. The Indian Heaven Wilderness, the Goat Rocks Wilderness, the Mount Adams Wilderness. These areas contain hundreds of thousands of acres where you can hike for days without seeing another human, where the only sounds are wind in the high canopy, rushing water, and the occasional cry of ravens. This combination of extreme isolation, dense cover, rugged terrain, and documented strangeness has made the region a focal point for cryptozoology researchers. The International Cryptozoology Museum lists the Gifford Pinchot as one of North America's most active areas for Sasquatch encounters. Local residents in the border towns of Randall, Trout Lake, and Carson speak carefully about such things. It's not quite skepticism and not quite belief, but rather a practical acknowledgement that the forest holds mysteries that don't fit into neat categories. Many have stories. Fewer share them with outsiders. The Forest Service maintains professional neutrality, but rangers will sometimes, off the record, describe experiences that defy explanation. Tracks that match no known animal. Vocalizations that wildlife specialists cannot identify. Areas where even 20-year veterans feel inexplicably uneasy and choose to conduct patrols only during daylight. Certain locations have acquired particular notoriety. Dead Man's Trail, a 7-mile loop in the southern forest, earned its name from a pattern of disturbing experiences. Hikers consistently report an overwhelming sense of being watched along a specific 2-mile stretch, strong enough that several groups have abandoned their hikes. Trail cameras along this section either fail completely or trigger hundreds of times, showing nothing but empty forest. Vanishing Creek got its name from water that disappears underground through volcanic tubes, but the area has seen stranger phenomena. 3 experienced hikers in the past 15 years have reported sudden, complete disorientation despite clear weather and functioning GPS. All 3 describe the same thing: an inability to determine direction, a period of confused wandering, then inexplicably finding themselves back at a familiar landmark with no memory of how they got there. The volcanic geology adds another layer of strangeness. The region is honeycombed with lava tubes, caves, and underground passages. Some researchers speculate these could provide shelter for large unknown animals, allowing movement through the landscape while remaining undetected. Indigenous traditions held Mount St. Helens as a dwelling place of powerful spirits. The mountain remains active, periodically venting steam, constantly monitored by seismologists who know it could awaken again at any time. As development consumes wild spaces across America, the Gifford Pinchot remains genuinely remote. Here you can still experience true isolation, complete darkness, silence deep enough to hear your own pulse. But that isolation can shift. The silence can feel watchful rather than peaceful. The forest itself seems to possess an awareness that predates human presence by ages. This is the landscape where, beginning in the spring of 2018, a series of encounters would occur that would challenge everything. Experienced woodsmen thought they knew about these mountains. Encounters that would be documented, investigated, and debated. Encounters that remain to this day completely unexplained. In the deep Cascades, the forest keeps its secrets well, but occasionally, for reasons no one understands, it allows those secrets to be glimpsed. What follows are 3 such glimpses, witnessed by people with no reason to lie and every reason to remain silent. People who saw something in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest that should not exist, yet does. Tom Mackenzie had spent 28 years with the U.S. Forest Service. At 53, he knew the Gifford-Pinchot better than most men know their own backyards. He could identify tracks in poor light, navigate by terrain when fog turned the world white, and had pulled more lost hikers out of impossible situations than he cared to count. He was not a man who startled easily or believed in things that didn't leave evidence. April 23rd, 2018 changed that. Spring melt had come early and hard. Heavy snowpack was running off fast, washing out trails throughout the district. Tom drew the assignment to survey damage along Old Growth Grove Trail, a path that wound through some of the forest's most ancient trees. He started before dawn, his truck the only vehicle in the trailhead parking lot, as gray light crept over the ridgeline. The trail climbed gradually for 2 miles through second growth forest before entering the old growth section. Here the world changed. Trees that had been standing for 600 years towered overhead, their lowest branches 100 feet up. The canopy was so dense that undergrowth thinned to almost nothing, creating cathedral-like spaces between massive trunks. Light filtered down in that strange aquatic way unique to ancient forests, dim and green and timeless. Tom had walked this section hundreds of times. He'd never felt uneasy here. That morning, about half a mile into the old growth, he smelled it. At first he thought dead animal, maybe an elk that hadn't made it through winter. But as he continued, the smell grew stronger and wrong. Organic, definitely mammalian, but with a sharp, musky edge like wet dog, amplified and mixed with something else. Not the sweet rot of decay, the smell of something alive. He slowed, scanning between trees. Black bears were common, but it was early for them to be active. Most would still be den groggy, not ranging far. This smell was too strong, too concentrated. The trail curved around a massive cedar, and he saw the ruins. 30 yards off trail, hidden behind young hemlocks, stood the collapsed remains of a logging camp shelter. 3 walls had fallen inward, roof long gone, floor reclaimed by moss. A rusted iron stove lay on its side in the debris. Tom didn't recall any camps marked here on the historical maps, but small operations often went unrecorded. The smell was much stronger near the ruins. He approached carefully and saw the tracks. 4 clear prints in mud near the collapsed entrance, where a seasonal seep had created a wet patch. Tom knelt, and his stomach tightened. Each print was roughly 18 inches long, 7 wide at the ball. 5 distinct toes, arranged like a human foot but proportioned differently. No claw marks. The depth suggested serious weight, well over 250 pounds. The stride between prints measured nearly 6 feet. Tom had seen thousands of animal tracks. These matched nothing in his experience. Too large for human, wrong shape for bear. Bears showed claws. These didn't. The toes were clearly separated, the depth uniform, suggesting bipedal walking. He was photographing the third print when he heard the knocking. Deep in the forest, maybe 100 yards out. Wood on wood. 3 deliberate strikes. Pause. 3 more. The pattern repeated once, then silence. Tom stood slowly. The forest had gone completely quiet. No bird calls, no breeze in the canopy, nothing. That's when he saw it standing by the creek. 80 yards away, partially hidden by a Douglas fir, something stood at the water's edge. Too tall for a person, too broad. It was bent forward slightly, looking down at the water, absolutely motionless. The only reason he spotted it at all was the reddish-brown color against the darker bark. Tom took a step forward for a clearer view. The head turned, slowly, deliberately. And Tom found himself staring at a face that wasn't human. Heavy brow ridge sloping back to a conical skull. Broad, flat nose. Dark face, either skin or short hair. He couldn't tell. But the eyes locked him in place, deeply set beneath that pronounced brow, looking directly at him with unmistakable intelligence. Not animal curiosity, assessment. The way another person looks at you when they're deciding something. The thing had to be 8 feet tall, shoulders massively wide, arms hanging past where its knees would be, covered entirely in shaggy reddish-brown hair. They stared at each other for 10, maybe 15 seconds. Tom's heart hammered. He couldn't move, couldn't look away. Every instinct screamed danger, but he stood frozen. Then it simply walked into the forest. Not running, not crashing through brush, just walking. Upright, bipedal. 3 strides and it vanished between 2 cedars. No sound of breaking branches, no receding footsteps. Just gone. Tom stood there breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. His hands were shaking. 28 years in these woods, and nothing had ever affected him like this. He made himself walk to where it had been standing. The tracks were clear in the soft ground near the creek, 18.5 inches long, 8 inches wide. He could see dermal ridges on the toe pads. He photographed them, measured them, documented everything with the methodical precision of a man trying very hard not to think about what he'd just seen. The stride leading into the forest was enormous, 5.5 to 6 feet between steps. He followed the tracks 40 yards to where they entered thick undergrowth. Branches pushed aside, creating a tunnel through the salal. The smell was overwhelming here. That musky wrongness that triggered something primitive in his brain. He didn't follow further. Tom completed his trail survey on autopilot, seeing nothing, his mind replaying those eyes beneath that heavy brow. The forest felt different now. Every shadow seemed occupied. Every sound made him turn. Back at his truck, he sat gripping the steering wheel, hands still shaking slightly. He had photos, clear tracks. He'd seen it in broad daylight from 80 yards. It had looked directly at him with eyes that showed awareness. He drove back to the ranger station and went straight to his office. Door closed. Downloaded the photos. Studied them. The tracks were undeniable. Whatever made them had been there, was real. Had stood looking at him with intelligence in its eyes. Tom wrote his standard patrol report, trail damage assessments, nothing more. He saved the photos to a personal folder and said nothing to anyone. That night, he barely slept. When he did, he dreamed of being watched from darkness between trees. He never went back to that section of trail. When assignments came up for Old Growth Grove, he found reasons to delegate them. 3 months later, he took early retirement, told everyone he wanted time with his grandchildren. Partially true. What he didn't say was that he couldn't walk into deep forest anymore without feeling watched, that the smell sometimes came back to him, triggering fear he couldn't control, that he knew, with absolute certainty, he'd seen something that wasn't supposed to exist. In his final week, Tom encrypted the photos and uploaded them to secure storage. He wrote a detailed statement of what happened that morning, dated and signed it. Then he told his supervisor that if anything unusual was ever reported from Old Growth Grove Trail, there was information that might be relevant. His supervisor, who'd worked with Tom for 12 years, studied him carefully. "You okay, Tom?" "I saw something out there," Tom said, "and I'm not the only one who's gonna see it." He was right. 2 years later, it happened again. Jake and Emily Thornton had been backpacking together for 7 years. Both were experienced in the backcountry, the kind who checked weather obsessively, carried proper gear, and knew wilderness protocol. Jake worked as a software engineer in Portland. Emily taught high school biology. They weren't the type to spook easily. Late July 2020, they planned a 3-day trip to Junction Lake in the Indian Heaven Wilderness, a remote section of Gifford Pinchot at 5,200 feet elevation, 8 miles from the nearest trailhead. During the pandemic, they'd been desperate for open space and solitude. They got more solitude than they wanted. They reached the lake by late afternoon, set up their tent on a flat spot tucked into mountain hemlocks about 50 yards from the water. The evening was perfect. Clear sky, no other campers visible. They filtered water, ate dinner, hung their food bag properly, and turned in around 9:30. Emily woke at 3:12 a.m. to a sound she couldn't identify. Wood on wood. Rhythmic knocking from somewhere near the lake. 3 deliberate strikes. Pause. 3 more. Then silence. She shook Jake awake. They lay listening in the darkness. The knocking came again. Closer this time. Maybe 60 yards from their tent. Same pattern. 3 and 3. "What the hell is that?" Jake whispered. Before Emily could answer, a new sound started. A deep, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate in her chest. Not mechanical. Organic. It rose and fell in pitch for about 10 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Jake unzipped the tent fly slightly. Moonlight illuminated their campsite in silver and shadow. Nothing moved. Their food bag hung undisturbed. The humming came again, louder, from the direction of the food bag. It had a guttural quality that made Emily's skin crawl. They didn't sleep much after that. Morning brought sunshine and a sense of foolishness, until Jake noticed their stuff sack had moved. He'd left it by the tent door. Now it sat 10 feet away beside a log. "Did you move this?" he asked Emily. "No? Maybe it rolled?" "Uphill?" Near the log, in a patch of bare dirt, Jake found a partial print, just the toe section, but clearly visible. 4 distinct toe impressions, each larger than a human thumb. The print was at least a foot long, but the heel was on rocky ground that showed nothing. They searched the campsite perimeter. Near the lakeshore, where the ground was softer, they found complete tracks. 18 inches long, 5 distinct toes, deep impressions suggesting serious weight. The stride length was massive. Jake counted 7 clear prints in a line that led from the forest, past their tent at about 20 yards, toward the food bag, then back into the trees. Something had walked through their camp while they slept. On the side of their tent, at roughly 6 feet high, was a smudge mark. Dirt or mud, still slightly damp, as if something had brushed against the fabric. Emily photographed everything with shaking hands. Her scientific training warred with growing fear. They discussed leaving, but decided to stay. This was their wilderness too. Whatever it was, hadn't shown aggression. They set up Jake's GoPro that evening on a small tripod, facing the campsite. Motion-activated recording. If it came back, they'd have evidence. It came back. Around midnight, the knocking started, closer than before. Then footsteps, heavy, measured bipedal, moving through the forest parallel to their camp, maybe 40 yards out. The steps circled their position, moving from the lakeside around to the forest side, then stopped. Jake gripped the bear spray. Emily gripped his arm, breathing shallow and quick. The humming began, much closer. The tent fabric vibrated with the sound, deep, resonating, seeming to bypass her ears and vibrate directly in her chest. The sound rose, held, dropped in pitch, cut off. Something was standing very close to their tent. They heard breathing. Slow, deep breaths. Too much volume, too much depth to be human. In and out, in and out. Neither of them moved. Emily's heart hammered so hard, she was sure it could be heard outside. The breathing continued for maybe a minute, though it felt like hours. Then footsteps, moving away, not hurried, just walking. The sound receded into darkness. They lay rigid until dawn, not speaking, barely breathing. At first light, they checked the GoPro with shaking hands. Most of the footage showed an empty campsite in infrared. Then at 12:41 a.m., motion trigger. A massive dark shape moved across the left edge of frame for 3 seconds. Too tall to be fully visible. The infrared showed heat signature, definitely alive, but detail was poor. At 3:47 a.m., another trigger. The shape moved slowly past the tent, closer this time. For one frame, just one single frame, part of a face was visible at the edge. Heavy brow ridge, dark eyes reflecting infrared, then gone. Emily stared at that frozen image. That was not an animal. That was not a person. That was something else. They packed in under 20 minutes and hiked out. 8 miles. Jake checking behind them constantly. Neither spoke much. At the trailhead, they sat in their car for a long time. Emily uploaded the footage to cloud storage. They had photos of tracks, video of something walking past their tent, one frame showing a face that shouldn't exist. Jake called the ranger district 2 days later, left a vague message about unusual wildlife activity. The ranger who called back asked standard questions. Had they been threatened? No. Had they seen what made the sounds? Not clearly. The ranger thanked them, noted the location, said they'd monitor the area. Jake didn't mention the footage. Saying it out loud would make it too real. Emily showed the video to one colleague, a wildlife behavior specialist. Her colleague watched 3 times, studied the frame with the face, handed the phone back. "I don't know what that is," she said quietly. "And I'm not sure I want to." The Thorntons never returned to the Gifford Pin Show. They still hike, but some boundaries once crossed change everything. They'd crossed one at Junction Lake. The footage remains in Emily's cloud storage. Sometimes late at night, she looks at that single frame, those eyes, that brow, that face watching from darkness while they slept 30 feet away. She learned later about Tom McKenzie, the ranger who saw something at Old Growth Grove Trail and retired shortly after. She wonders if he has trouble sleeping too, if he sees it when he closes his eyes, if he knows what it's like to realize you're not alone in the forest, that something is watching back. Carlos Rivera had been hunting the Gifford Pin Show for 16 years. Before that, 8 years in the Marine Corps, including 2 deployments to Afghanistan. At 41, he understood how to move through hostile terrain, how to read signs most people missed, and how to stay calm when adrenaline spiked. He'd been charged by a wounded black bear in 2014 and dropped it with a single shot at 12 yards. He did not rattle easily. October 15th, 2022, changed that. Bow season for black-tailed deer had opened in early September. Carlos had drawn a permit for a wilderness area in the southern forest, remote enough that he rarely saw other hunters. He'd been in camp 3 days with limited success when, on the afternoon of the 15th, he caught movement along a ridgeline about 2 miles from his tent. At first, he thought deer. He froze, scanning through the trees. The movement came again, but the scale was wrong. Too tall. Something was walking along an old logging road about 80 yards ahead, moving perpendicular to his position. Upright. Bipedal. Massive. Carlos crouched lower. His first rational thought was another hunter carrying a deer on his shoulders. But the proportions didn't fit. The shoulders were too wide, the arms too long. The figure stopped in the middle of the road, standing in full sunlight. Carlos had perfect visibility. It was holding a tree. Not a branch, but an entire tree, maybe 20 feet long and 8 inches in diameter, broken off cleanly. The thing held it in one hand like Carlos might hold a walking stick. The figure was covered in dark brown hair, shaggy and thick. It stood at least 8 feet tall, possibly more. The head appeared conical, rising to a point. Massive shoulders sloped down to arms that hung past where the knees would be. Even from 80 yards, Carlos could see the musculature, built like a powerlifter, but the proportions were completely wrong for human. He slowly brought up his binoculars. Through the magnification, details emerged. The brow ridge was heavy, sloping back sharply. The nose broad and flat. The face was dark, nearly black, with hair thinning around the features. Not quite human, not quite animal. Then it turned and looked directly at him. Carlos felt his stomach drop. He was in full camouflage, downwind, had been completely silent. There was no way it should have known he was there. But those eyes locked onto his position with unmistakable precision. The face was somewhere between human and something else. The eyes were deeply set beneath that heavy brow, amber-colored, catching the afternoon light. The expression was unreadable. Not aggressive, not afraid, assessing. They stared at each other across 80 yards of forest. Carlos had his compound bow in his hands, arrow nocked. He was a good shot, had taken deer at this distance, but every instinct screamed that shooting this thing would be catastrophic. This wasn't a deer. This wasn't a bear. This was something that was watching him with intelligence that made his skin crawl. The creature shifted the tree trunk to its other hand. Casual, effortless, like switching a phone between hands. Except the tree had to weigh 300 pounds. Carlos had worked construction. He knew what it took to move heavy timber. This thing handled it like a twig. It tilted its head slightly, still watching. The gesture was almost curious, bird-like, as if trying to figure out what Carlos was. Carlos slowly lowered his bow. He didn't point it down in submission, but he took his hand off the release. A deliberate signal. I'm not a threat. The thing seemed to consider this. Then, without any hurry, it turned and walked off the road into the forest. 4 strides and it vanished into undergrowth, still carrying the tree. Carlos heard no breaking branches, no crashing, just silence. He stood there 5 minutes, breathing hard, trying to process what had happened. This thing could have closed 80 yards in seconds, had the size and strength to kill him without effort. But it had shown no aggression, just curiosity. Carlos moved forward to where it had been standing. The tracks were enormous, 20 inches long, 8 inches wide. 5 distinct toes, clearly separated. The impressions were deep, over an inch in some places, pressed into hard-packed dirt that wouldn't take his boot print at all. He photographed them, measured them. The stride leading into the forest covered 6 feet per step. He followed the tracks 30 yards to where they entered dense young alders. Branches were pushed aside, some broken, creating a tunnel through vegetation 8 feet high. Carlos was 6'1". He would have had to duck. This thing had walked through upright. He found the stump where the tree had been broken off. Young Douglas fir, green wood, 8 inches in diameter. The break was 7 feet off the ground. The tree hadn't been cut. It had been twisted and snapped, wood fibers spiraled and torn. Carlos gripped the stump and tried to move it. Solid, rooted firmly. Breaking green wood this size would require enormous force, or enormous strength. 20 yards down the road, metal trail markers had been torn off trees and twisted into corkscrews, heavy gauge steel. Carlos tried to bend one with his hands. It wouldn't even flex. He photographed everything. Then he packed his camp and hiked out. He'd planned to stay 2 more days. He didn't spend another minute in that section of forest. At the ranger station, he filed a report in person. The ranger, a young woman named Sarah Cheen, listened carefully. When Carlos showed her the photos, she went quiet. "Mr. Rivera, have you been drinking?" "No, ma'am." "Any medications that might affect perception?" "No, ma'am." "I'm a veteran. I know what I saw." She studied the photos again, the tracks, the twisted metal. "I need to forward this to my supervisor. Can you leave your contact information?" Carlos never heard back officially, but 2 weeks later, a call from a private number. The man didn't identify himself, but asked detailed questions. Where exactly? What time? How long was the eye contact? Did you feel threatened? 40 minutes of questions. At the end, "Mr. Rivera, you're not the first person to report something like this from that area. You won't be the last. Be careful who you share this with." Then he hung up. Carlos told his wife. She believed him because she knew he didn't exaggerate or lie. He told 2 close friends, both combat veterans. One mentioned knowing another hunter with a similar Cascades experience, never reported for fear of ridicule. Carlos still hunts, but not in the Gifford-Pinchot. When people ask why he avoids such prime territory, he gives vague answers about changing his routine. The real reason is simpler. He knows something lives in those woods that shouldn't exist. Something strong enough to snap trees and twist steel. Something intelligent enough to assess a threat and choose not to engage. Something that looked at him with eyes that showed awareness. Late at night, he thinks about that moment of eye contact. The way it tilted its head. The way it seemed to evaluate him. And he wonders what it decided. Whether it's still out there. Whether, when you're alone in the old growth, that feeling of being watched isn't paranoia. It's accurate. Tom Mackenzie knows this. Jake and Emily Thornton know this. Carlos Rivera knows this. The forest keeps its secrets well. But occasionally those secrets step into daylight, hold a tree like a walking stick and look at you with amber eyes. Then step back into shadow, leaving only tracks, only questions, only the certainty that what you thought you understood about the wilderness is incomplete. In the deep Cascade forests where mist clings to ancient trees and silence has weight, something walks upright through the old growth. Something watches, something waits, and now you know it too.